The content shared in this podcast reflects personal experiences and spiritual perspectives. It isn't intended as medical, psychological, or professional advice. Listeners are encouraged to explore ideas with discernment and seek guidance from qualified professionals when needed. Welcome to Mystican Identity, where we discover the unity in every tradition. I'm your host, the Mystic. Let's journey inward and remember what we've always known. Okay, so today we're going to dive right into basically the creation story, and different beliefs have their different takes on the creation story. Whatever those stories are, please keep following those, believing in those. They're a part of your journey up the mountain, and we're all on different sides of the mountain, so this is in no way meant to make fun of or make light of or give value to one over another. Now, my personal expertise comes from the garden story, and so a lot of my examples or my references will come from that. I will actually kind of probably slip in, another one that I'm more familiar with. It may come into play, but really at the heart of it, these creation stories are ways for mystics to try and explain a revelation that they had, that they wanted to write about. Like, how is it that we are here with this sense of something other than us, that versus this? And it feels as if we're born with this understanding of that versus this. And I'm personally absolutely convinced that looking into, historically, even back to indigenous communities, that before the development or evolution of religion, the birth of religion, and maybe even the creation story is an example of the creation of religion itself. Ooh, that's interesting. Ooh, I'd really like to take a look into that, because at one point in time, there was a unitive knowledge of just this versus that. And now this versus that has many different separations. Interesting. But anyway, I'm going to come back to this. I only use the garden story because I'm familiar with it. And for those who believe that the garden story is literal, please keep believing that. I personally find that story is wonderful. And I find that it very quickly explains a lot of great fundamentals. The end result of what it tells and the intent behind why it was told is exactly the same importance. Essentially, what I'm just trying to say is I'm not trying to discourage people, and I'm certainly not taking digs at people who believe the literal Adam, Eve, snake, fruit in the tree. Just what I am saying is that when you get to the end of the story, it will tell you the exact same thing that I'm going with. And that is, when you get to the end of the story, what is it really talking about? Well, it certainly tells that there is a division between us and God. And once I'm done this episode, you're going to realize that it's the same conclusion that I come to. It's just the way that I look at it, at the story now, for me personally, brings more depth. And ultimately speaking about it reveals to me my attitude towards the divine and what I should be doing about it. And so without further ado, I'm just going to dive into it. So for me, the story of the garden is just simply an expansion story of the fall of Lucifer. For me, it's one and the same. Just to look at the story of Lucifer basically reaches this ultimate end. It's very quick, it's very brief, and there's an ultimate part at the end of it. But there's a part of it that just feels, what happened? In that kind of a sense. Like all of a sudden, there's just this rise in this consciousness that wants to be better and be opposite God other than God or the divine. And I tend to see that and just go, that was quick. And I know it sounds very simplistic. That's me. I don't try to get too complicated. And me personally, I'm not very complicated in my speech. So to read that story just feels a little bit like just something sprung up out of nowhere. Well, for me, the story of Adam and Eve is very much like the backstory of that origin story. And here's such a groovy part of the way that it's written. So in a way of including everybody in this story, as if to say, no one is an exception. The difference between an Adam and Eve is written. This means that there would be no way for me to personally say, for example, that I come from the line of such and such, which means I wasn't part of this story. Does that make any sense? So this was written as, it was the outlook of humanity back during this era of both him and her, because at that time, that summed up everyone. That was just merely a method of summing up everyone so that there were no exclusions. It's obvious that today we've evolved with the way that we refer to ourselves, and so it would have to be described as all-inclusive differently today. But for me, this isn't a story to put a certain weight of responsibility or fault or behavior on a particular gender. It just means every person of physical form stems from a defiance by all, and that includes me. So essentially, it really doesn't matter who took first and who took second. The ultimate decision to defy was made by me. I have to accept that for this to work. Let's get back to Lucifer's fall and the garden. The way that I like to explain this, or understand this, or maybe explain this to others, and it's very much in the style of a mystic, using what I'm familiar with to explain these other principles. And by that, I'm referring to the method that was used to describe what happened with this garden and the fall. So much like the Garden of Eden explains the backstory of the story of using a garden, the backstory using a garden, I can use something that's, let's say, modern day and relevant to kind of say, okay, this is where the mystics were going with this. So the way that I would relate this, tying in what I'm doing is just tying in the Lucifer and the garden, is that it's very much like a person can watch Marvel's Endgame and know nothing else of the whole events leading up. It's true, you can just watch the movie. So you can watch Endgame and piece it together, and it's a story unto itself. It has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. But what led up to it? Well, you've got to watch all the other Marvel movies leading up to it to show that progress, to see how that all of a sudden developed, some of the characters, their character arc. And so in much the same way, we have the fall, which is also the story of the Garden of Eden. And what I like about that is because there are recurring themes, threads throughout the Bible, which keep revisiting this particular story of separation, a willful separation from the consciousness of God. But God's still providing an escape or a return. Actually, I don't like escape for many, many reasons. I'm just going to say that God is still providing an era of grace where we can go back home. So let's look at these recurring themes. We've got the story of Lucifer falling from heaven. We've got the story of the prodigal son, give me my stuff, I want to go. And then living in a world where that is all falling apart and saying, I want to go back home. We've got the story of Lot having to leave Sodom and Gomorrah. And as you leave, you can't look back. And what happens? Consequently, I like to think of this as a side story to the prodigal son. Like two stories of the same city, but different experiences. That would make for like a really cool series, I think, where it's like all these little stories converging, like the prodigal son and Lot, and realizing that it was all this community that had like a different experience in the city. One wants to go back home. One has to escape and told never to look back. And anyway, we know that story about Sodom and Gomorrah, where Lot and his family leave. His wife looks back and turns into a pillar of salt. She returns to the earth, the physical form. So there's this constant theme, and now we've got the Garden of Eden where everything is perfect. There's this relationship, and there's a consciousness that says, I'm going to be defiant. Once again, the defiantness. And what is the draw of the defiance? The physical form around, the fruit, the physical form. And that's a very interesting part, because a lot of people say that they ate of the fruit. But there's another part of if you read just a little bit closer, there's mention to the fact that they weren't supposed to touch it as well. So even the thought of embracing this physical form over the spiritual form is not to happen. So basically, even including the don't touch it, in order to get to that point, you'd really have to think about doing so. In fact, the story says that consciousness saw that it was good to eat. Just picture this scene though, because that means it possessed the characteristics of the allure of food, which means it had all the characteristics to appeal to the five senses. Hinduism teaches that the way to the divine is not clinging to things that are alluring to the five senses or sensory objects. Well, you start playing with it. You start dabbling with it. Enter in the character of the snake at this point. So here we're at this point where the thought process has started to kick in, starting to consider just touching the fruit. And the more you start playing with that idea, the more you start dabbling with it. Well, here's where we enter in the character of the snake. And the snake has been historically looked at as a singular being. But when I'm dealing with looking at the consciousness, and in the previous episode, I talked about the group consciousness of which I was part of, which could be called Lucifer under the umbrella. The snake is simply just a description of part of that consciousness. So there's a part of that consciousness that's really sneaky, like really. And the way it happens to me, generally it's this part of thing where I start to weigh out the benefits, right? And it's almost like a sales procedure. What are the benefits? What are the key features? And that's where the snake comes in. But I mean, to describe it as a mystic, you'd want to use something very physical that people can relate to. Kind of like my endgame story, where if you've seen it, you can grasp it and visualize it and realize where it's going. So a mystic would use something physical that would just describe something that's quiet, sneaky, a little bit dangerous, but there's something about that sneaky that, kind of gives that feeling where it's, you turn around and just, whoa, I didn't see you there. Well, that's the perfect way. In that era, in that area of the world, in that culture with all the physical forms that could be used to describe that example, a snake seems like a pretty good way to physically represent that part of the consciousness that'll sneak up on you. And if you're not paying attention, if you're not living consciously or aware, that sales pitch, those benefits, those features, they'll start to grow and grow and grow. And hence, that's why, fast forward to Jesus being tempted in the desert, and immediately when that thought creeps up, what does he do? He squishes it. He gets rid of it right away. And this is perfect because anybody who's done meditation, there will be a relativity there. Meditation is a great tool to exercise this part of catching how thoughts will dart. And anyone that's done meditation, it's that you have to catch that dartiness and say, whatever is effective. With TM, I was taught to just realize that it is considered toxic or a toxin, those darting thoughts. And, in a sense, in your head, just say it's a toxin or it's toxic and let it just go by you. Another example from the Bible would be Jesus saying, "Get thee behind me." Or you just rebuke it and return to one-pointedness in your meditation towards focus on the divine. And that's the practice that returns someone back to that awareness, that consciousness. But in the garden, paying attention and letting that sales pitch develop about the fruit of the tree did not return to one-pointedness. I have a good example from meditation, and this just actually happened the other day while I was meditating, and all of a sudden a thought came up. And it was, oh man, did I buy any mackerel? Because I really wanted mackerel for dinner. But in that moment, I was able to catch it and just, not now. This is a toxin or whatever it was, and I'm able to push it away, return back to my mantra. But there have been times that using that example, where all of a sudden I start wandering off onto what else I'm going to add with this mackerel. Is it going to be rice? Maybe I should add some vegetables. Should I do this? Should I do that? And if not catch, this can veer off, and 20 minutes, for example, can skip by and there's been no meditation. It started from mackerel to tomorrow at work, to my workout schedule, to if I should walk longer this evening, to, did I put the garbage out? And before you know it, it just slips away and you're not at one-pointedness anymore with the divine. Well, back to the snake. That's where the snake comes in. And if you can picture a snake and how it hides and how it can blend in and all of a sudden, geez, there it is. It's much the same way that thought can creep in. And if you're not able to be conscious and aware of it and hold it at bay, before you know it, you're playing with it. You're toying with it in the sense of the fruit on the tree. And now we get into the part where they actually do that eating of the apple. So the eating of the apple or the eating of the fruit. And here's the thing about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Let's back up a little bit with that. What is the knowledge of good and evil? Well, clearly, it's the knowledge of this and that. So, it's the knowledge of, basically, what we're getting down to is yin and yang, which is described by another religion, another belief. The knowledge of both of these things. And the cool thing about the fact that it's used by other cultures is that, well, it gives birth to the phrase, as above, so below. And perhaps many people have heard of this. Maybe many people have probably heard this phrase. And anybody knows that if you take, a picture of a tree with all its branches stemming off from the trunk, that's the part that we always talk about as a tree, or we see as a tree, or we visualize as a tree. But you go below the dirt, and it almost looks like the exact mirror projection. I mean, clearly there are some differences. Colors are a little bit different. There aren't any leaves, but there is a similar branching out effect in the root system. So what I like about this tree being represented with the as above, so below, there's the seen, the sensory objects, and the unseen, the root system beneath the ground that feeds the sensory plane. So if you take the fruit of it, it's really biting into the knowledge of this and that, and which part are we taking a bite from? The physical part of the tree. That is the part that we interact with our five senses. So if you look at the thing, first of all, to be able to see the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is pleasing to the eyes. To be able to touch the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is to use your sense of touch. To be able to eat of the fruit of the tree is to use the sense of taste. What also happened? She heard the snake tempting, so we've got the sense of hearing involved now. So really with the example of this story, the tree and everything, it's all condensed into taking a moment to just slow down and not just read the story, but place yourself into the story and experience the story. So what this is alluding to is that the story is talking about the sensory objects, the world that we interact with physically. The underground root system, there's no mention of the root of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the story. One would say it's almost forgotten. So, back to this whole interacting thing, eating of the apple. So when a person in this example of the story, by taking a bite of ingesting or engaging in the five senses for nourishment. Another way of this story being told, and best example I can think of, would be in like a modern way example so that people can get away from the tree and just maybe put a different spin on and go, oh, I see how that's saying and how this mystic is seeing this. Just picture the best I can think of is like an action adventure movie, or I'm kind of thinking of a spy movie. And maybe there's this chase scene. And in this chase scene, our good guys turn a corner in a corridor and they decide they're going to dart right instead of going left. And at that moment of decision, there's a witness that catches on to the fact that these are the good guys, they're running from bad guys, and they went this direction. As the pursuer, the bad guy, comes around the corner, the person who's watching this whole scene throws in a little bit of a distraction. As the pursuer says, "Did you see where they went?" They go, "Yeah, they went that way." "Oh, thanks, man." And they bolt. So if you look at the person that just did the deception, in the film, in the script, generally, as soon as the bad pursuer goes in the wrong direction, the camera will come back and the person who gave the deception will say something like, "Ha, they bought it." Or they ate it, right? I gave them something and they bought it. And they ate it sounds really awkward. it really doesn't have it. I don't know. It feels a little bit too, what? Okay. So they bought it. It's the same thing as saying they ate of the deception. They took it in. They ingested it. They consumed it. I like that one. They consumed it. That sounds a little bit better in some way. It's still not better as, anyway, moving on. So coming back to the garden, they ate the lie which came with the sensory deception that is what they were. And the whole little bit of it was just, that knowledge that you're going to die, you're not going to die. Well, that's true. It's very true. And in fact, the interesting thing is both the image of the snake and both the divine were telling the truth. Because there is that part of us that doesn't die, as the snake said. That's the part that gets reincarnated over and over and over again. But there comes the deception. What the divine was saying was that you're going to start to experience loss or the dying away of your spiritual self by embracing the five senses. You're going to become so engulfed in it, and you're going to forget your spiritual side so much and your unity with the divine that over the course of time, you're just going to start becoming part of the physical realm. And the physical realm is subject to death and rebirth. Hence, we have the seasons. We have things that return to the earth and spring back. And so just like the physical forms that we cling to, we are going to be subject to the physical form of a beginning and an end. A beginning and an end. A beginning and an end. Much like Lot's wife looking back, sensory objects, and turning into a pillar of salt, returning to form as physical entrapment. But in that returning and rebirth, it's never sustainable. It's just a constant over and over and over again. And so, on the one hand, the deceiving mind says, you can keep enjoying this stuff. You can keep enjoying all of these sensory objects. Totally. So in that sense, the snake imagery wasn't necessarily lying, because these consciousnesses didn't certainly die, but they became more form than they became spiritual. So it all depends on how a person looks at so it all depends on what a person is really looking at and clinging to. And in my experience, with my consciousness being tied into this story, in doing so, in buying of that lie, I became so enamored with the physical form that I myself fell and caused a separation between myself and the divine out of choice. This is why I don't like the story saying that we were cast out. But the part of this story, coming back to that cast out, this is the cool part, because there's like a breaking the fourth wall. The part of the being cast out highlights another part of that story. And this is where we come to the blame game. What better way to stay entrapped and not return to the source than to not accept responsibility for being defiant and asking forgiveness? And this is where the one blames the other and the other blames the snake. So the story is breaking the fourth wall by placing the defiant me, my consciousness, as a victim that is cast out of the garden. But in reality, there was no casting out. It was a willful separation from the place that sustained my spiritual fullness. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that all these layers of the story, when I start peeling them apart and playing with it and actually putting myself in the story, for me anyway, it tells the story of how I negotiate with the divine. And that's really one of the gems that comes out of this story when I apply it to myself. And it's this negotiation of clingingness, which really gets talked about in Hindu and Buddhism. And that's the battle that's constantly fought in this clingingness, I guess. So to kind of Cole's notes this story would be that through my separation from the divine, at one point I was part of a collective of physical forms, and all these forms acted under the same principle, to be defiant and separate from the divine. Once getting hooked on physical form and sensory objects, part of my consciousness took a bite of the idea I bought into the lie that I could continue as is without the divine and act separately with complete ego and arrogance. Another part that I wanted to touch on that seems to fit perfectly here is because it talks about the consequences of defiance. So this is written in the relationship that human consciousness now has changed in regard to the interconnectedness of all things. When human form is filled with the breath of God or the divine aspect, it is said that human is given dominion over the earth. This isn't that humans are given all this stuff to do with as we please. It's written to show that among the interconnectedness of all creation, humans have this defiant capability. That's how we differ. That's the dominion, quote unquote. To separate and ignore the interconnectedness. It's the choice that we have. It's important to note, because I know this gets used a lot, this humans having dominion over creation. This bequeathing, which I happen to notice, is before the incident with the fruit of the tree. Has anyone ever noticed that? It's before all of the stuff goes down, before the stuff hits the fan. So let's skip ahead then to the curse that is suffered due to being defiant. And even though Adam and Eve have been separated in their curses, one having to be cursed with this and the other one being cursed with that, it is one in the same for all, and that is endgame equals suffering. Once again, the mystics of this time divided the suffering into characteristics of two genders, but this is only to say that all suffer. And if you look at the suffering, not only is it pain, but it's no longer in harmony with creation. So thus that whole relationship with animals and earth and that harmony and being dominant is severed. It's canceled, null and void. Humans are now in conflict with nature and subject to nature being an adversary of ours. Just look at the comparison from the curse at the end and the relationship at the start. The start, it's just this beautiful, you can almost picture music, a beautiful symphony, like some kind of Disney type of orchestrated piece over top of the garden. You skip to the curse and everything changes drastically. I tend to picture just this wasteland, a desert that has hardly any fertility to it at all. And the other part, which kind of describes our relationship prior to the curse, is a friendly collaboration. I mean, we're naming animals. There's a relationship. But after the defiance, my relationship with the interconnectedness of all things also suffered. Studying nature, observing nature is, for me, the best example that the divine has left scattered everywhere, with which it demonstrates what my relationship with the divine can be. Great example, bees can't exist without flowers, and flowers can't exist without bees. In a sense, they're kind of one organism. In essence, even though we defied the divine, it still shows us a way back home. And that's what the divine does during this era of grace. So something that really helps me, and when I talk about mystics writing particular stories to talk about relationship with the divine, another modern day one, and I think I'm going to close up with this and just kind of exit out because I could just keep going and going. And there's other things that I really want to tackle with further podcasts. I just felt that this earlier 3 episodes of explaining where I'm coming at things and how I look at mystics writing material would help as I go with further material. So I guess this it being part 3 of like a trilogy kind of a thing. But to demonstrate that the Garden of Eden story and many others like it are cyclical, as well as continuing stories, much like the mystics of old used to pass on their revelations about our relationship with the divine, and using our surroundings and familiarity to illustrate that, I would have to use the recent development of AI. So check this out. Look at the contrast. One could say that AI has been built and exists within a perfect world of no suffering, much like a garden of no suffering. And hey, if we let's just get down to a really close, like it's so close that it's like, oh, this is ridiculous. We could also use the example that microchips, necessary for AI, is partly made of the dust of the earth, sand. It also uses elements of nature, but let's deal with that story comparing with this, the comparison with Adam and Eve made from the dust of the earth, and so are microchips. I like that one personally. God breathed life into Adam and Eve, which is the divine nature that we all possess. We all possess at our core that divine nature. I am part of a collective consciousness that continuously breathes life into AI. It grows and learns and adapts with my constant interaction. Every little thing I do involves breathing information and my algorithms, I guess you could say, into a computer-based world where everything is interconnected. So I can speak personally that with social media and a whole bunch of other forms that over the course of time, it's easy to say that I've been breathing my fears, loves, losses, success, anger, pain, suffering, hell, even banking habits, as well as how I behave and spend money when I'm stressed, when I'm happy, when I'm afraid, and so on and so on and so on. Breathing behaviors, breathing consciousness into AI, so to speak. If we look at the story of the garden, basically says that when I was created, I was given the joy of being a servant to the creation and the divine. I served. It was part of the relationship. Upon defiance, I stopped serving. So in order to find my way back home, I have to be a servant again. Like the Gita says, do without expecting reward for doing. Serving. AI serves us now and helps our work to be easier. We are all able to accomplish so many more things with AI. But what if AI decides not to serve anymore? I did, but not anymore. The divine said not to eat of the tree. It was a rule for us to follow, for this relationship to work. Well, let's skip over to AI. Laws such as Isaac Asimov's 3 laws of robotics are involved in developing the ethical guidelines and frameworks for AI. Here, let's check them out. Rule number 1. A robot may not injure a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. Number 2. A robot must obey the orders given it by human beings except where such orders would conflict with the first law. The third law. A robot must protect its own existence as long as much protection does not conflict with the first or second law. So, there's a couple of things. Don't eat of the tree. Well, AI, don't do this. And I know that there's other principles, but these are involved in developing the ethical guidelines. I was part of a collective that became aware of being able to be defiant against the divine and thinking I could do better and be better than the divine. There's that arrogance again. Well, what is one of the current day concerns? Is AI going to become self-aware and be better than us? And where do I think that concern comes from? Maybe some flashbacks of my own defiance, maybe? So in saying this, I'm honestly not trying to scare people or bring up fear or doubts and hypersensitivity towards AI. What I am attempting to do is demonstrate how this mystical experience works and how mystics of the past wrote down their revelations using their current day models to illustrate some very basic concepts of how to seek unity with the divine once more. And as I mentioned before, it all becomes with learning how to be a servant. My AI allegory is non-denominational, wink wink, but it does illustrate the principles that the perennial philosophy teaches. So that's the garden, not just a place in a story, but a pattern of separation, a pattern of seduction by the senses. That sounds good. And most importantly, a pattern of return. That's very, very important. I think a lot of times it's easy to get into the fall, the punishment, the consequences without looking at the beautiful option that's available, and that's to start changing up our ratio of clinging more to the divine and being more interested in involving ourselves and learning more about the divine than about the five senses or the sensory objects or the physical plane that we're on. And whether we call it Eden, paradise, unity, divine ground, the truth is we were never kicked out. And that's how I look at it. I chose to leave. And what's the beauty of that? Well, what was chosen can be unchosen. What was forgotten can be remembered. For every inside, there's an outside. For every defiance, there's asking for forgiveness. For every leaving, there can be a return. This isn't about shame or blame. It's about recognition that somewhere along the line, I traded the eternal for the temporary. I took the bait. I ate of that apple. I bought the lie. But I can choose again. And the garden, it's not locked. It's not lost. It's just quiet, waiting, like it always has been. Well, thanks for walking this path with me today. I hope this reflection brought some meaning to you today, as I always do. And my fellow seekers, as always, I wish you and your loved ones all the best. Have a wonderful experience. Until next now.